Grids in graphic design, similar to alignment, can provide an invisible structure to your composition that is used to guide the placement of all visual elements in your design. In some cases, like with this poster of 12 Angry Men, the use of a grid can be obvious, while in other designs, you might not realize that there is also an underlying grid to which all the elements are aligned to. The main purpose of grids is to make alignment easier in a composition, but also to provide balance and unity. It can look chaotic and unprofessional when every element in a complex composition is just floating around in space without any alignment. And the advantage of using sophisticated grid systems is that the alignments used in your design won't have to look so obvious, yet your viewers will still have a sense that everything is nicely organized in your work. To better understand how to work with grids, first we need to cover a couple of terms, and it is easier to show this here in InDesign. So here we have a spread made up of 2 pages. We have also the spine already visible here in the middle, that's that black line. And these purple lines are indicating the margins. And even just by relying on the margin guides, you can already establish some kind of structure. But because of the space between the margins is so large, if we were to place anything that is not connected to a margin, it would immediately feel like out of place or floating in space. So for instance, if I have a frame here on the left side and another frame on the right side, you can already tell that there is no real structure here and everything is placed completely randomly. This is never a good practice in graphic design, so even if you want to create a very open and dynamic composition, using a grid will always improve the balance and unity of your work. So let me just delete these 2 shapes and show you what happens if we introduce columns or column guides. So this is something that we would call a column grid. In this case, this is a 12 column grid, which means that on each page you would have 12 equally sized and evenly distributed columns. And this, as you can see, already gives a lot more structure than just simply relying on the margins. Also important to mention that the column guides only appear within the margins, so they don't overlap. This of course doesn't mean that you can't align items placed in the margins to column guides, but it is always better to divide the area within the margins by 12 instead of also including the margins. But even though we introduced a lot of additional lines to which we can align our content or visual elements, vertical alignment of items can still be tricky. And for this, we can introduce rows or flow lines, which will turn this column grid into a modular grid. And the reason why we call it a modular grid, because those cells that are created by the columns and rows are referred to as modules. So you can see on the top I marked the 12 columns and I also marked on the left side the 12 rows. And I also indicated the terms that we've been talking about. So you can see that here is a module. These horizontal lines we refer to as flow lines, while the other ones can be referred to as vertical lines or column guides. And we also talked about margins, which depends on which one you are looking at, will have a different name. So these ones would be called the outer margins. These ones in the middle on both sides would be called the inner margin. And then we have the top margins and the bottom margins. And when you place a visual element that takes up multiple modules, we would refer to it as a spatial zone. So it can be any amount of modules used for this. And remember, we also mentioned alleys, which are the gaps or spaces between your columns. And we call the 2 inner margins together as the gutter. However, this is a term even by Adobe sometimes also used to refer to the alleys in the composition. So whenever you create columns, InDesign will refer to the space between them as gutter. However, in terms of editorial design, this is the better or more correct way of using these 2 terms. And finally, the main area surrounded by the margins is called the content area. And now that you know what these terms refer to, let's jump back to our board and see grids in action. So here's a nice and simple example of a magazine layout. It is very easy to spot the underlying modular grid. So while the body copy and most of the typographic details are divided into 3 distinct columns, we can still see that there must be more columns used. For instance, these images here are not aligned to those columns underneath. Instead, they are taking up exactly half of the content area, which would be a spatial zone made up exactly of 6 by 6 modules. So 6 modules horizontally and 6 modules vertically. The alignment of the heading or title of this article and also this intro paragraph must also be aligned to flow lines. Similarly to this particular part here, which must be another flow line. And then of course we can see the gutter and also the alleys between the columns. Now I don't think that modular grids are only useful when it comes to layouts and editorial design. Even when designing posters, for instance, they can help to provide structure. And in this design, it is very easy to spot that underlying grid. So each of these letters are placed within individual modules. And we can see even these yellow lines are taking up exactly the same width as the characters. So they are marking the width of this column really well. Or the same thing here on the right side. And if we look at rows, like this one here, we can also see that the yellow lines, also here on the other row, is always placed exactly in the vertical center point of a module. So identifying this rule, I'm almost certain that we would find another module here. Remember what I mentioned at the beginning of this video, that grids don't necessarily have to be visible. And actually, most professional designers would use them in a way that it is hardly recognizable, yet still providing the necessary structure. So I'm not going to highlight the columns and rows anymore. You can probably see them by now, but still you can see that even though there is a grid here, how much freedom you have once you start playing around with how you use the modules in the grid and also how you define your spatial zones. So if I use a vertical line and start moving it across this design, you will see a lot of details aligned to each other. So there we already have an alignment. We also have another alignment section here. We can go one step further in, and then once again another alignment happening here, and so on and so forth. We can see an obvious one again showing up here, another one showing up there, also another one showing here, also another one here, and so on and so forth. So you must recognize by now that especially with more complex designs where you have a lot of information to display, using and relying on a modular grid will always give you more security and aid to find placement for all your visual elements. And grids, of course, are not only used in print design, but also in web design, and almost all websites would rely on some form of grid. Like in this case, we can see a 5-column grid in action. So there's column number 1, 2, which we can find the edge here and also there. There's column number 3, 4, and then 5. Grids in web design are most obvious when we look at blogs. And by the way, I highly recommend to check out our creative blog on yesimadesigner.com, where we regularly share inspiration, tutorials, and news from the creative industry. And there's one final term going back to print design and layouts, and that is the baseline grid, which can be used in combination with a column grid or modular grid. And the sole purpose of a baseline grid is to make sure that all lines of text, especially in the body copy, will be aligned vertically, not only within a page, but also between pages on a spread, and even throughout the whole magazine, and especially in books. The issue with not using baseline grids is that even with a slight difference between the vertical placement of your lines can get distracting when thin paper is used for the pages of a book, for instance, which will reveal slightly the text printed on the other side of a page, and while reading the text, that subtle shift can get really confusing or distracting. Thanks a lot for watching. Like and share this video if you enjoyed it. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon to get notified whenever we release new videos. Click on the link on my right and start your membership today to get access to over 200 hours of training courses and personal mentoring by me and my team of creative professionals. Have fun learning, guys, and I will see you in the next one.